This is the second in a series of interviews with Father Malachi Martin. It is being recorded in his home in New York. Father, in this discussion, we're going to take a look at the situation from the perspective of the average layman in the pew. He's starting to realize that in many cases, in virtually all cases in fact, something is going wrong in the world, something is going wrong in the church. And we'll start right with his home and his family. And many parents are finding it very, very difficult to raise their children because there's all these influences on them that seem to be anti-Christian. Could you maybe comment on the difficulties that a family has in raising its children, and what are the sources of these difficulties?
Yes, it's worth talking about that, Bernard, because the mass of Catholics are laymen and laywomen with children and jobs and homes, and they live in certain areas, and they have to cope with the situation in their areas. And the universal experience in the West, forgetting for the moment the East in the sense of the former Soviet Empire or the Far East, but talking about the West, that is North America, South America, and Western Europe and Australia and New Zealand. It's the same story everywhere. From all the magazines and books that come out, it's quite obvious that nowadays it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, extremely difficult, requiring heroic virtue to rear your children and to yourself and your wife, or yourself and your husband, to behave in a way which formerly was regarded as normally Catholic. What has happened, and why is it so difficult? And is it going to change? And are you simply out of step? Should you be in step with the general march and stop worrying about things? Look, there are a few things we must comment on, first of all. The essence of Catholicism. You see, in my life, I have found non-Catholics, Greeks, Russians, Syrians, Protestants of all kinds, very pious and good. I mean, sometimes they were saints in my estimation. But missing was one Catholic ingredient. One typically Catholic ingredient. And if you don't find this ingredient, you haven't got Catholicism. It's this. If you examine the entire sweep of Catholic theology and pastoral care over the centuries, down to the middle of this century, you'll find that Catholicism meant many things. It's a rich storehouse, by the way, which we're neglecting nowadays. But it's a rich storehouse, but one note always came out. There is a thing called Catholic intimacy with the divine. What does it consist of? Oh, listen, apparently very simple things. It's prayer to the Blessed Virgin. It's devotion to the angels. It's novenas. It's the Blessed Sacrament being visited for 5 minutes to say hello, to console our Lord, to talk to him, to ask him about the problem of that mortgage, to talk about that child who's playing truant, to talk about your difficulties with your wife or your husband. Then it's benediction. It's the repetition of hymns. It's the constant flow of thoughts and devotions and recommendations from the Pope through the bishops to the people, and from the people through the bishops to the Pope, and pilgrimages. And it is this network of intimacy with all things belonging to heaven, because Catholicism set out to establish on earth a replica of what heaven is, so that you can have the food of angels every day, and you can assist at the supreme sacrifice of Jesus, and you can embrace his wounds every day in Holy Communion, and you can talk to Our Lady and get her help, and your boys can grow in the image of Christ, and your girls can grow in the image of Our Lady. And then there would be special people set aside, devoted to him, like priests and nuns and religious orders. And then there would be the occasional special event like a pilgrimage or a special mission. But it all centered on this uniquely Catholic trait of intimacy with the divine. We were allowed to have our conversation with heaven. As St. Paul says, our conversation is with heaven on this earth. Now, what normal people have found is that suddenly that is cut off. Suddenly they are expected to dialogue with each other. Suddenly they're expected to regard the priest as somebody the same as them. Suddenly they're supposed to treat Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament as something very separate from their lives. Suddenly they're supposed to engage in sociological and in environmental studies instead of studying anything about their faith. Suddenly they find that the rosary is no longer prominent and is not sold even in churches. Suddenly, in other words, everything is taken out from under them. They find their children coming home from school saying that, well, the Buddhists are very good, they're just as good as us, only they have different faiths. Then they find the bishops writing on purely sociological and anthropological questions and political questions, no longer have their stream of devotion and teaching about the life of Jesus, about hell, about heaven, about sin, about purgatory, about the truths of our faith. All this has suddenly gone. It's been cut off. That's the basic obstacle they find today. The result is that they find that what they thought was Catholicism is no longer Catholicism. They find that at Mass they're not supposed to spend time in thanksgiving. They're supposed to sing hymns which no longer are Catholic hymns. Sometimes they're hymns to nature. Sometimes they're poems about men and women. Sometimes they're quotations from Buddhism or Hindu books. And then they find that at Mass itself, there's no longer the devotion centralized on the altar. It is centralized on somebody dressed in leotards doing a dance. Or it's centralized in peculiar banners and in new forms of expression, even drawn from natural, say, events like storms and seas. They no longer have a spiritual vocabulary. Everything has changed suddenly. What did happen? What produced this? Well, if you see ever an overall phenomenon affecting millions of people, and there are millions of people in the two Americas and in Europe, and it is all stamped in one way and comes at you suddenly, comes at them all, you can be sure that it didn't happen by chance. In other words, we know now that this has been a concerted plan being put in action by an organized body of men. The difficulty is that since it is so universal, we know that it started at the top. It didn't start in one diocese. It didn't start in one country. It started in Rome. Because the church is so arranged that the pipeline from Rome flows into all dioceses. And we can track now through the various pontifical organizations and through the communications in those pontifical organizations, we can track the instructions and the directives given, so that overall in the church, in the West, in Europe, in the Americas, in Australia, in New Zealand, this message would go out loud and clear. This is the way you do it. This is how you conform. And it's a terrible situation because it has affected people in Rome. For instance, John Paul II did issue an indult called Ecclesia Dei, which says that we must, after all, take care of the sensibilities of people who want the old way of doing things. And therefore, we must have some measures that will take care of their wishes. Cardinal Meyer, who is in charge of this, recently has made it quite clear that this means that he will restore the Mass in certain places, and he won't restore it in other places. And when asked about it, he said, well, that's the meaning of the indult, that the bishops can do what they like. And this is a twisted view of what the Ecclesia Dei indult originally meant. It means that Cardinal Meyer is no longer free. It means that in Rome there is this super force that they cannot dislodge at their peril. And that therefore that has a hold of the teaching church. Recently, when the Pope appointed conservative bishops in Europe, 173 theologians signed a document, Germans and Belgians and French, saying the Pope had overstepped his authority. And nobody has said they haven't been condemned. In 1984, when John Paul II wanted to make the Tridentine Mass, if you want to call it that, a rite on equal parity with the Novus Ordo, 4 cardinals flew to Rome. Basil Hume of Westminster, who is no longer Catholic in my estimation, that's my own personal opinion, Cardinal Lustiger of Paris, and 2 more flew to Rome and browbeat him into saying, you cannot sign this document. He didn't sign the document.
There seems to be a network which frustrates people like Cardinal Meyer, who are, let's say, trying to implement traditional forms of Catholicism.
That's right. There is a network which frustrates them. And the fact that they cannot do anything about it means it's powerful, means it has all the levers of power in its hand. And therefore that this is one of the reasons why John Paul II knows all renewal is impossible. He cannot do anything about it. He had to excommunicate Archbishop Lefebvre, instead of going himself to Econ and performing the ordinations, which was his original wish. He couldn't do that. He wouldn't be able to get back to Rome, probably. Because here's the essence of that organization, Bernard, and it's frightening. There is a large body of highly placed clergy, beginning with cardinals and going down as low as Monsignore and then into priests, who have one aim in life, and that is to make sure that any exercise of Petrine authority obsolesces and falls into desuetude. And de facto, they have brought church administration to the point that the Pope no longer exercises papal authority, except in a rare case when it's useful to them, the excommunication of Lefebvre. But otherwise, he doesn't exercise it. You see, there are two ways of my getting rid of you. You are with me in the company and you have a job. And I don't like you. I want to eliminate Bernard Jansen. Well, I can try to get you killed. I can try and get your job suppressed and you fired. Or I can arrange it so that your job becomes otiose, becomes pointless. You shuffle papers. You have no influence on company policy. You have nothing to do with the sales of our goods. You have nothing to do with the financial aggrandizement of the company. You sit in your office. You are useless. You have obsolesced. You're in desuetude. Your job is a sinecure. It means nothing. That is the aim of the present superforce, to make sure that the Petrine exercise of those keys ceases. And therefore, that it will be more or less like the ostrich feather fans they used to wave around the Pope when he was on the sedia gestatoria being carried in public. They're just relics of the past. Oh yes, we used to do that, but we don't do it any longer.
In other words, their goal is to make the Pope somewhat like the Queen of England, just a symbol.
Yes, but the ultimate aim is destroy Petrine authority. Destroy the unity of the Church around Peter. And that's the destruction of the Roman Church. That's the aim. And if you examine carefully the behavior of a thing like the Bernardine machine, as we call it in the United States, it's Cardinal Bernardine of Chicago who runs the bishops, the USCC and the NCCP. You'll find that it's always an endeavor to say, well, we Americans think this. We can't adopt the Roman point of view. And the French do the same, and the Spaniards are doing the same, and the Germans and the Belgians, and the Latin Americans are trying, some of them are trying to do the same thing. It's an effort to make sure the Pope does not exercise authority, because once he ceases to exercise it for a amount of time, it obsolesces. He doesn't do that. He has overstepped his authority, as the 173 signers of the Cologne Declaration said. You have no right to do this. You're Bishop of Rome. You administer that. Leave us alone. We can manage our own church in Germany, our own church in America, the Americanist church. That's the aim of it.
Let's take a look at what happened after the appointment of this East German bishop. After there was that protest, the next bishop to be appointed was Casper to the Diocese of Stuttgart.
Walter Casper has written several books. He's a prominent theologian. He's been in the Synod, the Roman Synod, several times. And from his books, it is extremely clear that Walter Casper no longer holds with the Magi coming to see Jesus, no longer holds with the Ascension. In fact, several truths of the faith that we've always believed that belong to Catholic intimacy with the divine no longer hold for Walter Casper. Why make him a bishop? Well, I suppose you could ask the same question about Bishop Lehmann, who in his book seems to lean in favor of the fact that St. Joseph was the natural father of Jesus. How can these men become bishops? Because the superpower is in charge. How does that work? It works like this. If you think, or if anybody thinks the Pope decides to make Bernard Jansen Bishop of Strasbourg and writes a letter to Bernard saying, "You now Bishop of Strasbourg, come and be all consecrated by me," then you have another thing coming. That is to pass through the bureaucracy-sodden and laden mechanisms of the Vatican, which is peopled with the superforce. All with their instructions, all with their anti-papal mentality, all with their point of view, ready to scotch things, ready to guide things, to push things at the bottom of the pile, to refuse an appointment, to make it impossible to do it. Bureaucratically, he cannot just sign a document. There are 5 or 6 signatures that go with it.